Welcome to the Mind Story Speaker podcast. This particular podcast is sponsored by the Memory Imprint Journal 30-Day Challenge. In 30 days with this journal, you can dramatically increase a sense of confidence, inner peace, and purpose. You do this by writing out good experiences from all times of your life. Most of us tend to remember bad experiences 10 times more than the good ones. It's just a flaw of how our minds are structured. Unfortunately, that can make people fearful of the future. By doing 30 stories in 30 days, it's been shown to create a new default habit in the mind whereby you start attracting better outcomes in your life by doing this. And you can give it a try for free by joining the 5-day trial version of the 30-day challenge. Just look in the show notes below for the link or go to www.mindstoryacademy.com, the free tab, and you'll see how to join up there. I'm so excited today to have Christina Merkley as a guest today. She's from Shift It Coaching, her company, and her methods bridge left brain, organizational development, and strategic planning with right brain, graphic facilitation, and emotional intelligence. And as you know, I think it's very important to have both when you're doing any kind of coaching, training, or speaking if you really want to have impact. And she's been amazing at blending those. Since 2001, she's been a lead graphic facilitator specializing in strategic planning and visioning, working with huge corporations, small businesses, and individuals as a facilitator, coach, and trainer. And I love her style of working. It's like visual storytelling. So let's get started with our first question. Welcome, Cristina.
Hi, Carla. Thank you for having me.
You're welcome. So briefly tell us what you do, especially when it comes to helping people make shifts with visual storytelling.
Well, in a nutshell, I basically draw out and help people see themselves. And then depending on what they see, make changes from there. And I work with both groups and individuals. So I work as a consultant facilitator with the groups, and then I work as a coach and a mentor with individuals.
And so what's your philosophy on how to use stories as a coach? How to get people into their right brain when they're getting coached, as opposed to what so many coaches do is they're just doing strategy?
It really depends on the person and what they're coming there for, because sometimes they might be there for left brain. And I do that, but most of my work is visual. So I'm literally drawing out what people are saying and thinking and feeling. It's a mirroring device, if you will, to kind of mirror people back to themselves. I guess the philosophy is I'd rather draw it out of people than impose stories on them. With some of the work, with the organizational work, we do sometimes impose stories, right? There's change management and an organization is trying to go somewhere. And maybe the leadership team has determined what that path is and the story to evoke people and get them into what that story is about. But as a coach, I just like to really do a lot of listening, and people show themselves, right? In how if you're a good listener, they speak visually. I'm listening for the similes and the metaphors that just emerge out of people. It's going on inside of them anyway, so this method helps draw it out so they can really grasp it and see it and start to interact with it.
And I think it's the way, as you say, how our brains are organized in metaphors and stories and imagery. So it's so important that we be putting that into the kind of work we do with people. And why is that so important to affect real deeper change for people, in your opinion?
Because it's the subconscious. And the subconscious was where change ultimately lies. You know, there's a whole gamut of work that can happen, right? And some of it is quite surface level, more of the organizational work, depending on where they want to go and are comfortable going. But with individuals, we can go much deeper. With individuals, if you can use different methods, and the visuals does it and other methods do it as well, and I combine a lot of them. If you can get a communication going between the person's right brain and their linear left brain, right? It's more a translation issue. And the subconscious speaks in color, in pattern, emotions, right? It's not linear, it's not words. So I can teach people different methods to A, tap into their right brain, and B, be able to translate what's coming across. because it's not in words. And sometimes it takes a bit to teach people what is coming across and how to interpret it.
Yeah, and I'm sure it's that phenomenon of we all have these set points that are at the subconscious level that aren't going to shift just with willpower and
right.
strategy alone.
Yeah, and they're often there because they got set up earlier in life where they were really serving you. And so you want to go in with not an attitude of hunting something down in order to eradicate it. You want to go in with curiosity and an open heart. And as long as I've been doing this, I've learned to do that because there's such a different response you get when you get curious and you take it that this must be set up in this person for a reason, a very good reason. So let's come at it with that approach. And usually things go a lot better when you take that kind of curiosity, right, and open-mindedness.
So what's a case study or story or example of how you've helped someone shift with your methodology?
Well, we're talking about stories. And so, and I was saying how I prefer to draw out stories as opposed to impose them. Somebody I was working with last week, and she's an example of a story being imposed from somewhere else. So she comes to me, and she's a practitioner. She's works as what's called a graphic recorder, a graphic facilitator, more in this organizational setting. And she's having a lot of problems with comparisonitis, right? She's comparing her work to others. She's reluctant to just let her live work be instead of just fussing with it and trying to make it perfect and stuff, right? So I'll go in there and use a couple of different methods to find out who's uncomfortable. There's a part or aspect of her that when she's doing her live work, something's popping up. There's some sort of story. With her, it turned out that the story that was getting imposed was from her mom. And it was way, way back from when she was just in college, like kind of launching herself out into the world, and her parents went through a divorce. And she had a mother who was very accomplished and very beautiful and very sophisticated. And, you know, she kind of felt like the ugly duckling and could never measure up to her mom and her mom's presence in the world. Her mom's since passed, and this woman's in her 60s now. We were able to connect what was going on at the surface in her now 62-year-old life to, you know, this earlier stuff that got set up. In bringing it up into the light of day and doing various things with that, it's really a rescue that kind of happens and a retelling that happens. And this is really going to the right brain, but her mother is deceased, and we entered into a conversation with her mom that really opened up how my client was holding it, that it actually wasn't her mom who was pushing this. It was how she had misinterpreted her mom. And the mom just really giving her, from her new vantage point, permission really to be herself and shine and do things her way and stop this decades-long comparison to herself. The mom actually communicated a couple stories too from her own challenges, right, of how things got set up in her to have this kind of perfectionism that got passed down to her daughter.
So how did it play out after that for her?
Well, she had a feeling of relief in the immediate, so that's always my sign when something has changed and shifted. But she's got more looseness in her work. When you're hampered by trying to be perfect, you can't be spontaneous and you can't try new things. So now she's got more leeway to experiment and be in the now and go with what is emerging and taking some risks. So that's what she reports out to me. But typically that's what I see with people is it's back to the subconscious, right? There's back to that deep patterning. When you get some wiggle room with that and you get some permission changing, it has results on the outside that are usually really beneficial for people.
That's what I've noticed too. And you did some work with me that I thought was very powerful. I mean, it's interesting. I relate to that story too, as I'm sure lots of other women. that I had a mother who was very, she walked in the room and everyone sort of turned their head. She was very potent, very powerful. And I had big perfectionism thing going on too, and I studied improv theater to help me get over that because, you're forced to be spontaneous over and over again.
There it is again, right? The live where you can't construct it. You just got to go with your instincts. Yeah.
But I remember having to go back in and relook at my relationship with my mother at that time. And so that's super interesting. It's very potent work.
Yeah. And we don't, again, our left brain, our conscious mind is not realizing that another part of us is lining up to an old story, what those symbols meant back then. So when you encounter something that has similar symbols in the now, the subconscious is going to, in the right brain, right, is going to make that connection to, danger, danger, that's what this stuff means, right? When I feel this certain thing or these certain things happen in my life, then X equals Y, like this is what's going to happen. And, that's not the case. That's what happened in the past, but this all happens so fast, right? And it's often underneath the conscious level for people. So I love that work because you never know what you're going to find. And it's always so elegant what the connections are and what the hookup is from the now situation to what occurred in the past that somebody's complicating things in the now with.
Totally. And so what are some mistakes you find you need to avoid when doing visual stories as a coach?
This is more with group work, but remember I was saying I like to have them emerge or draw out as opposed to imposing?
Right.
So metaphors are really tricky. When you select them well and they emerge from a group or an individual, they can really work beautifully, but you can really get yourself in trouble when you try to impose one. This is kind of a war story. I was working with a entrepreneurial women's organization, very large one in the US. They actually came up here to Canada and I was working with them. And I worked with the design team and we figured out ahead of time, we were going to do some typical, what I thought was going to be typical planning. So we had a bit of visioning and some goal work and stuff to get to where they wanted to go. And there's a certain form that I tend to use. It's very basic. It's got an arrow pointed towards a circle. And I don't know if you can, with that short little description, understand what that might be metaphorical of from some people's lens. To me, I was thinking it's just, I've done it a bazillion times. I just see a circle and an arrow. For this particular group, that was seen as being very phallic imagery. So yeah. So phallus into the egg, right? And patriarchal, and fury erupted in the room. And I think my paper actually got ripped down, which I thought was kind of funny and dramatic, right? Like, whoopsie, that was not anticipated. And the sponsor, the woman who brought me in, was a little concerned for me. But, that's a huge lesson. And I tell it in a lot of my courses because I teach people how to do this stuff organizationally and individually. And I'll say, like, be really, really careful with your metaphors. And that whole thing about a picture is worth 1,000 words. A metaphor is worth 1,000 pictures, right? So the double click of what happens, right? And if you choose a metaphor wisely and that's in sync with the group, there's all this meta information that gets transferred very quickly. But if you choose it unwisely, like in that situation, then you get this great big mega explosion happening, and very quickly, like, wrong metaphor, ouch, wrong metaphor. If that's the wrong thing for that group, that's the wrong thing for that group. Like, good information, it was fine. We got there in a different way.
I mean, it brings us back to that theme of perfectionism. And if you do any kind of speaking, training, coaching, facilitation, I mean, everyone's got a war story like that where something they said or did or put up there just had the wrong reaction. And so what are your tips?
The group wisdom. So, okay, that didn't work. That wasn't my intention. What do we do from here? And turn it to the group and they'll sort it out.
Oh, I love that. That's a great example. I always remember the first time I had a really challenging speaking experience. And when I look back, it's one of the best things that ever happened because it built my resilience. But I was speaking on fun in healthcare and in the cancer center. The HR person brought me in and she thought it'd be great. And there were all these nurses and then all these doctors came into the room. And I was just like a few minutes into the talk and a doctor stood up and said, "What makes you think we have any time for laughing and playing with the patients? We're trying to save lives here. This is a waste of time. I suggest everyone leave."
Wow.
And I remember, I was so green at being out on the speaking circuit. I just froze like a deer in the headlights. But so a number of the doctors actually walked out and some of the other people did as well. And the people who stayed, I did actually what you suggested, which is I said, well, how do we move forward from here since I've come all the way out here to work with you? And most of the people that stayed were nurses and they say, hey, we love this topic. Let's keep going. Let's find a way of integrating it in a way that doesn't take away from the life-saving things we do here, but that works with the doctors. And so we just went into I totally threw out my notes and we went into, that sort of facilitated discussion, which you're suggesting.
And you have to be willing, right? Like you have to be willing to throw away your notes. And for me, throw away the big template on the wall, right? Or the draft 1.0 that you had and not be attached and go with what needs to actually merge in the group. I was working with people who were nudists. and I'm doing strategic planning and visioning and stuff with them. And then I turn around and the main guy is like, took off his clothes. I guess it was getting a little too hot for him in the room. So that was pretty bizarre. I got a phallic theme going on here.
So when you first started, they were clothed, but then they have this norm that they can.
Part of their thing was, I guess, okay with nudity in the body, which I can be in certain circumstances, but it was kind of strange. That whole thing, like you do speaking, right? And it's like, imagine them without their clothes on.
and it's actually happening.
I didn't have to imagine. So that was a little like, okay, like, where do I look? And what do I do? So
that's very funny. I've never had that happen. That's hilarious. So you helped me shift a story from my childhood that was keeping me stuck by helping me rewrite a timeline, which I find really interesting, the whole concept of timeline, especially when it comes to, what we call a mind story. How do stories help you shift disempowering timelines to more empowering ones? Say a bit more about that.
I come from a background with strategic visioning and planning. And I do the same thing with individuals. So there's a lot of opportunity to hop around times. We can go into the past and we can draw out the history map or of the organization or the life map of the individual. Usually we're wanting to not just talk about what's happened or what is currently going on, right? The now timeline. Usually they're wanting to do some growing or developing or changing. So that's the future timeline. And various things you can do with organizations, various things you can do with individuals to bop them out to a best case scenario timeline where whatever it is that they're wanting to accomplish has happened and it's turned out in a really great way. Get people into that world, those relationships and that environment and that vibration and frequency, if you will, as a juxtaposition to where they've been and where they are. And then there's just a lot you can do once you've established that. I think we might have done this with you as well. That aspect of yourself who's out there, who's already done it, is such a wonderful ally and in a way becomes the best coach or facilitator going, right? Because they've been there, they've done it, they know what it's like, and they can whisper or shout back directions and encouragement and even ways of doing it differently than how they might have done it. So there's a lot. That's my most fun work, is doing that future self work, or even the future self's work, right? If the future self can't do it, go even farther and find out who can. And then the other example I gave you with the timeline, the one of my client with her mom, that's an example of going into the past and jumping that timeline, bringing it forward, not holding on to something that's no longer relevant and maybe even got misinterpreted way back when. And that client felt regret at having spent so much time living under a certain impression. but at least she doesn't have to do it anymore, right? So there's no more wasted time beyond what's already happened.
That's what I notice, is that it's almost like you look back on a life that came from that more disempowering point of view, like, say, a perfectionistic mother, and the times that you sort of shut yourself down instead of being your most creative self. And yeah, it's easy to feel regretful, but there's something I find interesting, and I just wanted your comment on it too, that if disengaged from it, do you sometimes notice that you can look back on times in your past when maybe you did do something disempowering to yourself, that somehow it takes on a new meaning because you have this new timeline in place?
You mentioned the rescue work. So there's a protocol I do called Orphan Rescue. And that can be really powerful because, yes, you get the insight about what happened back then, right, in the past, but you don't have to just leave yourself out there on that timeline. There's different kinds of integration work where you can bring that aspect of yourself home, and you can bring him to the now, or if for whatever certain reasons you're not able to look after those aspects of yourself, you can engage the future self or other aspects of yourself to look after those earlier wounded aspects. So there's a lot of time jumping that can happen, because when that aspect is rescued, it's fascinating. You literally aren't that person who had that thing happen back then. You're the person who rescued that part back then, looked after it, brought it somewhere else, and now get to benefit from that healing.
Yeah, it's almost like that Mandela effect. For those of you who are unaware of the Mandela effect, it's this phenomenon where this large number of people have a different memory about an event or fact than others. So, for example, Nelson Mandela's death in 2013 was the initial event to spark the conspiracy because multiple people remembered him dying while in prison in the 1980s. People claimed they recalled news clips and TV coverage of Nelson's funeral, but that's not what happened. After being released from prison, the activist was the president of South Africa, and he lived for the next 3 decades. But Nelson Mandela's death was not the only example. Since then, people have found multiple instances. And I've noticed that in my personal life, where something I remembered one way, I now remember it in a different way, almost like I've changed the timeline. And I think that's the power of stories and the meaning you give stories in your life. You know, I remember talking with my sister about how it was in our family, like, say, when we're in our early 20s. But now when we talk about what happened, it was a different past. And it was the same past, but because it's being interpreted in a different way, you remember different things. And maybe the things that were negative have fallen away, or even in some cases, I would say forgotten. Like, I can hear my sister talk about something that she used to complain about, and she doesn't even remember it anymore. So I don't know if that's a Mandela effect thing or not, but
there's various things that'll help us change that focus for good and for bad. I mean, you can focus on things that are really serving you, and that has a great impact, or you can focus on things that don't. But I run something called the Shift It group, which is with my Shift It process. And one of the things we do is we do life maps. So we draw out our life to date, right, in this visual method. And I post up my own. It's quite vulnerable to do this in a group, and it's an online group where we post stuff up. So I post my own, right, just to level the playing field a little, because I know how vulnerable it is to post stuff. And I had posted my history map, and it's getting kind of out of date, and I kind of cringed looking at it because how I view those things has changed. It's been about a decade. I'm now 50. I did those life maps right around when I was turning 40. And oh my goodness, what a difference a decade can make. And all the inner work and constellation. I use constellation method, which is very helpful for family dynamics and things. And, it's literally like a different person wrote those life maps. And I am a different person after a decade.
So at this point, I'm sure people are wondering, how can they learn more about you? So tell us what you got.
Well, you can stick in my name, Christina Merkley, into a search engine, and it'll pull up all sorts of stuff. The site that has centralized about me is my Shift It Coach site. So shift-it-coach.com. I run a school. It's called the Shift It School, and it's mostly an online school, although I do have some things in Victoria, BC, and some other nice places around the world occasionally. So I run a whole gamut of programs, and I have a private coaching practice as well, and occasionally do facilitation. I don't do a whole lot of corporate stuff anymore, but occasionally I do organizational work.
Great. So you can see that link in the show notes to check it out. Christina's got a lot of really interesting offerings, so do check it out. As I said, I'm very impressed with Christina's work, so I highly recommend her. Okay, well, thank you so much for your time today. It's been really fascinating.
Thank you, Carla. I appreciate you asking me, and I appreciate having the time to just kind of share a little bit. And visuals are very powerful, so I hope it alerts people to another tool that they might want to use in the process work they're doing.
Great. Okay, thanks. Bye for now. So thank you for listening. Feel free to rate this podcast on iTunes. Until next time, I'm Carla Rieger.